Clara never planned to stand in someone else's uniform staring up at the iron gates of the most expensive townhouse on the entire block. But life didn't care about plans. One phone call from the housekeeping agency, one moment of pity for Mrs. Lopez, who had fallen sick with a fever just hours before her night shift, and here Clara was, clutching a borrowed apron that smelled faintly of bleach and lavender. She told herself it would be just one night. She would wipe the marble counters, straighten the expensive pillows, turn off all the unnecessary lights, and lock the door behind her before the sun could even remember to rise. Easy, quiet, invisible. That was what the agency promised. Rich people didn't see maids, especially not at midnight, especially not in this part of town, where money made walls higher and secrets deeper. She pushed the heavy gate and stepped inside. The townhouse loomed over her, 4 stories of glass and stone catching the streetlights like polished armor. The front door was already ajar. Mrs. Lopez must have left it for her replacement. Clara paused on the threshold, breathing in the faint scent of fresh lilies and something expensive she couldn't name. She told herself not to be impressed, not to imagine who lived here, not to think about rumors. Alexander Reed was just a name on a mail slot to her, a billionaire in magazine pages, a man so private that tabloids could only invent stories about the women he never married and the empire he never lost control of. None of it had anything to do with her. Tonight she was just a replacement, one set of hands for another, a shadow passing through someone else's castle. Inside the marble foyer, her shoes squeaked against the polished floor. She glanced at the grand staircase that curled up into darkness and wondered which door was his, which room was locked, which secret slept behind walls thick enough to swallow a whisper. Clara shook herself. Stop imagining. She moved through the living room, turning off small lamps the last shift had forgotten. She straightened a stack of design magazines she didn't dare touch. She wiped a fingerprint off the glass coffee table, though she was sure it wasn't hers. Every small task calmed her heartbeat. This was what she was good at. Quiet things, small things. She could be invisible here, just like always. The kitchen was spotless, but she still opened the fridge to check expiration dates like Mrs. Lopez had taught her. Her mother used to say people's refrigerators revealed their real lives. This one was full of carefully labeled containers and expensive glass bottles. But no leftover takeout, no comfort food. Everything was perfectly arranged, like someone cared more about the look than the taste. She closed the door softly. The clock on the microwave blinked back at her. Almost midnight. She would finish the checklist in an hour. After that, she would disappear back into her own life, the one with student loans and late shifts at the library and cheap coffee that tasted like burnt hope. She made her way upstairs, moving slowly, careful not to let the old wood floors creak. The second-floor hallway smelled faintly of cologne and cedar. A line of black and white photographs ran along the wall, but she didn't linger to look. She didn't belong here long enough to wonder whose eyes stared back from those frames. In the guest bathroom, she checked the towels, refolded one that wasn't perfectly square, and sprayed the mirror with glass cleaner. Her reflection stared back at her tired hair tucked under a plain headscarf. For a second, she almost didn't recognize herself. She looked like a girl pretending, a girl who had stepped into a life too big for her skin. She sighed, turned off the light, and stepped back into the hallway. She paused at the far end near a half-open door. It wasn't on the checklist. Maybe a study? Maybe a storage room? She shouldn't look. But something about the cracked door called to her. The quiet beyond it felt too heavy, like a breath waiting to be caught. She pushed it open just enough to peek inside. A bedroom. Larger than her entire apartment back in Queens, dark except for a sliver of city light spilling through sheer curtains. She saw the edge of a massive bed, the corner of a polished wardrobe, a glimpse of something soft and white draped over a velvet armchair. Her heart thumped. She should close the door. She should finish her checklist. She should be anywhere but here, standing in the hush of a billionaire's bedroom. But her feet stayed planted. Her eyes caught on the folds of that white fabric. It looked like a dress. Not just any dress. Satin, maybe. Silk, something too fine, too soft, too impossible for someone like her to ever wear. She took a small step forward, her fingers curling against the doorframe. Just a peek, she told herself. Just enough to say she saw it. Just enough to tell herself she never wanted to wonder again. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes. Somewhere in the house, a floorboard sighed under weight that wasn't hers. Clara didn't notice. Her eyes were fixed on the soft shimmer of fabric catching the city's glow. One night, she reminded herself. One shift. One secret she should never touch. But tonight, the rules felt thinner than the silk that waited inside that room. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she stepped further into the bedroom. The faint scent of expensive cologne and fresh linen drifted through the air. The dress on the armchair looked untouched, yet intimate, like someone had slipped out of it moments before she arrived. She should have turned around, closed the door, pretended she never saw it. But curiosity is a quiet betrayal. It led her closer until she stood just inches away from the soft fabric. Her fingers hovered over it. She imagined how it would feel under her palms, smooth and delicate. Something meant for someone else's skin, not hers. Behind her, the floor creaked. She froze. The silence that followed pressed against her chest, making it hard to breathe. Slowly she turned, expecting empty shadows. Instead, a figure leaned against the doorframe, watching her. He looked like he belonged to this room in a way she never could. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a simple white shirt sleeves, pushed up to his elbows, collar undone just enough to hint at the heat beneath the polish. Alexander Reed. She knew it was him before he said a word. The shape of him matched every rumor, every blurred photograph, every whispered story the agency girls liked to share behind locker room doors. He didn't speak at first. His eyes moved from the dress to her hand, then back to her face. The air between them felt too heavy, too charged for such a small room. Clara snatched her hand back, pressing it to her apron like it could erase what he'd seen. "I'm sorry," she whispered, but her voice cracked halfway out. He tilted his head, studying her, not like an intruder, but like a puzzle that refused to solve itself. "You're not Mrs. Lopez," he said, his tone calm but edged with something she couldn't read. Clara swallowed. "No, sir. She's sick. I'm just covering for tonight. I didn't mean to. I was just—" Her words tangled into silence. Alexander stepped into the room, closing the distance with unhurried grace. He stopped just a few feet away, close enough for Clara to see the faint stubble on his jaw, the shadow of exhaustion under his eyes. He smelled like the cologne in the hallway, warm and sharp and devastatingly clean. He glanced at the armchair, then back at her. "It's a dress," he said simply, as if she needed him to confirm it. She didn't move. Didn't dare. "Yes, sir, I was just making sure the room was tidy." She lied badly. He lifted an eyebrow. "By touching my guest's dress?" His voice wasn't angry, but there was an edge to it, something careful and quiet that made her throat go dry. Clara's fingers twisted in the hem of her apron. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. I'll leave. I'm almost done with the checklist." She stepped sideways, trying to slip past him, but he didn't move. Instead, he looked at her like he could see right through her cheap uniform and borrowed confidence. "What's your name?" The question startled her. Nobody asked that, not here, not someone like him. "Clara!" she breathed out. He said it once, testing it in the silence. "Clara." The way it sounded in his mouth made her stomach twist. He took another step closer, and she realized how small the room felt now. She could see the faint scar near his collarbone, a slash of old history half hidden by expensive cotton. "Do you always wander into rooms you shouldn't?" His voice dropped lower, softer, almost amused. Clara's mouth went dry. "No, sir, it was an accident, I promise." His eyes flicked to the armchair again. "Do you know whose dress that is?" She shook her head. "No." He studied her for a moment, so long she felt her pulse in her throat. Then his lips curved just slightly, not quite a smile, more like a secret. "Neither do I." he said quietly. The words made no sense, but they settled between them, heavy and strange. She didn't understand what kind of man kept a stranger's dress draped so carelessly in his bedroom. She didn't want to understand, but the way he watched her made it impossible to look away. Clara took another small step back, feeling the warmth of his presence follow her like a hand at her spine. "I should finish up downstairs," she whispered. He didn't stop her this time, but his eyes stayed on hers as she edged past him. When she reached the door, she glanced back, just once, catching his gaze in the dim light. Alexander Reed stood by the armchair, fingertips brushing the silk as if testing whether it was real or not. Clara didn't know what she saw in his expression, but it wasn't anything she'd ever seen in the gossip columns. It wasn't power or arrogance or wealth. It was something else. Something raw, something that made her heart trip over itself as she slipped into the hallway, leaving the secret behind her, but carrying the question like a spark in her chest. The rain started just after midnight. Clara stood at the large kitchen window, watching the city disappear behind sheets of water. She should have left by now. Her checklist was done, the floors mopped, the counters gleaming, the last room locked behind her. But something held her there. Maybe it was the way the penthouse felt so alive in the storm, like the walls breathed quieter when the world outside went dark and wet. Maybe it was the echo of Alexandra's voice in the bedroom that still clung to her skin like a secret she didn't understand. She made herself busy wiping down a spotless counter for the third time. The clock on the wall ticked louder than the thunder. Outside, the city lights blurred into gold streaks on the rain-soaked glass. Clara wondered what he was doing now, if he was still in that room, if he'd left the dress exactly where she'd found it. She didn't want to know, but she couldn't help the thought sneaking in anyway. The elevator dinged, her breath caught. She turned quickly, expecting another maid, maybe a security guard, to ask why she hadn't left yet. But it was him. Alexander stood in the doorway, sleeves rolled up, shirt slightly wrinkled, hair damp, like he'd stood on the balcony to feel the storm himself. He said nothing at first, just leaned against the marble island, watching her with that same unreadable calm. "You're still here." His voice cut through the hush of rain and ticking clock. Clara forced her hands to stop moving. She folded the cloth neatly, placed it by the sink. "I was just about to leave." She hated how small her voice sounded in the vast room. He glanced past her at the window, the thunder rolling soft in the distance. "The roads will flood if this keeps up," he said, more to himself than her. Clara nodded, but didn't move. She had no umbrella, no cab fare for this late hour. The last bus had gone an hour ago, but she would have rather stood at the stop than admit that to him. He seemed to read it anyway. "You're not from here, are you?" The question came out softer than she expected. Clara's eyes dropped to the floor. "Born here, raised in Queens, but this part of the city might as well be another country." He almost smiled at that, but it didn't reach his eyes. Instead, he crossed to the window, standing just inches from her. The rain tapped steady against the glass like 100 tiny secrets. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the weather and their quiet breathing. "You could wait out the storm here," he said finally. It wasn't a suggestion, more like an observation. Clara shook her head. "That's not appropriate, sir. I should call a cab." He turned to her then, close enough that she saw the faint lines around his eyes, the kind that didn't come from laughter, but long nights and endless worries. "Call a cab if you want," he said, "but you'll be standing outside for hours." She looked down at her shoes, cheap canvas sneakers already damp from her earlier rush. He was right. They both knew it. He stepped back, breaking the hush between them. "There's tea in the cabinet above the stove. You can help yourself." He didn't wait for her to answer, just walked out of the kitchen, his footsteps muffled by the storm. Clara stood there, alone again, surrounded by warmth she didn't own, and silence that felt too big for her small life. She should leave, she told herself again. She should grab her bag and run through the rain and never look back. But instead she reached for the kettle, filled it with water, and set it to boil. When she poured the tea into a white porcelain cup, her hands stopped trembling. She carried it to the window and stood there again, watching the rain blur the city into something softer, something almost kind. Somewhere behind her in the maze of rooms, Alexander Reed moved like a shadow, and Clara wondered if maybe for just one night it was okay to stand still, to listen to the rain, to pretend the storm outside was louder than the one inside her chest. Claire didn't remember falling asleep, but when she opened her eyes, the rain was still falling steady against the glass, and the kitchen light was dimmer, softer, like it had been left on just for her. The teacup sat empty on the counter. She rubbed her eyes, glanced at the clock. Nearly 3 a.m. She should have left hours ago. Should have called someone. Anyone. But the thought of stepping into the wet black streets made her stomach twist. She gathered her bag, checked the checklist one last time. Everything in order. The only thing left was the master bedroom, but she knew she wasn't supposed to touch it. It was the one place the supervisor had warned her about. Off limits even if she was covering another maid's shift. Clara didn't care. She respected boundaries. She had enough rules in her own life to know when not to break someone else's. But as she moved through the hallway, the door caught her eye again. It wasn't just a door. It was a wall of dark wood, carved with delicate lines almost invisible, unless you stood close enough to trace them with a fingertip. She paused, hand hovering near the brass handle. The same door she had seen earlier when she'd slipped the extra towels inside. The same door that hid that crimson silk dress, crumpled like a confession. Clara told herself she didn't care. She had seen rich people's secrets before. She cleaned apartments that reeked of perfume and regret. But something about this place made her chest tighten. She turned away. She could leave. She should. But the silence in the hallway pressed in heavy and suffocating. A faint light glowed beneath the door. She frowned. Maybe he'd forgotten to turn it off. Maybe he was asleep and the light would wake him later. Maybe, if she just peeked in for a second, she could fix it and slip out without him ever knowing. She told herself it was practical, responsible, just doing her job. She didn't let herself think about the other reason, the truth that she couldn't name. She reached for the handle, hesitated, felt her pulse flutter at her throat. Then she turned it slowly, praying it wouldn't creak. The room opened like a breath held too long. Warm light spilled out, bathing the hallway in gold. Clara stepped inside barely over the threshold. She expected chaos or luxury, or maybe something cold and sterile like the rest of the penthouse. But the master bedroom was different. The walls were painted a deep, calming gray, the floor covered in thick, dark carpet that softened every step. On one side, a massive bed draped in charcoal sheets. On the other, shelves lined with books, old spines cracked and well-loved. It looked more like a sanctuary than the den of a billionaire. Her eyes drifted to the far corner where a small reading nook sat under a large window. A single lamp burned there, casting light onto an open folder laid neatly on a mahogany side table. She knew she shouldn't. She hated herself for the curiosity that pulled her forward 1 step, 2 steps, until she stood by the chair. She didn't touch anything, just leaned in enough to see. Inside the folder were photographs, black and white, some old, some new. All of them showed the same thing. A woman, or maybe different women, but all with the same eyes, same smile. It took Clara a heartbeat to realize they all looked like her. She drew back, breath caught in her throat. She wanted to run. She wanted to laugh at herself for imagining things. But the photos were there, undeniable, like fingerprints left in wet cement. One photo sat on top, more recent than the rest. A woman standing in front of a coffee shop, smiling at someone outside the frame. Clara's heart twisted. She had a coat just like that. She had stood in front of that same coffee shop last winter, waiting for her bus. The realization sent a shiver down her spine. A sound behind her made her spin. Alexander stood at the doorway, half hidden in the shadow. He didn't look angry. He didn't even look surprised. He looked at her like he had been waiting for this moment for a long time. His voice was calm, too calm. "You weren't supposed to see that, Clara." She opened her mouth, but no words came. The folder was still open between them, a truth too heavy to ignore. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. Only the storm outside seemed real anymore, and the quiet, steady hum of her own heartbeat, reminding her she was still here, still breathing. But nothing would ever be the same after this door. Clara's fingers curled against her palm, as if gripping something invisible, something that might steady her in the hush that settled over the room. Alexander hadn't moved from the doorway, yet the weight of his gaze pinned her in place more effectively than any lock could have. She wanted to step back, to put the folder down, to apologize, to pretend she hadn't seen, but the images were already burned behind her eyes, and she knew that nothing she said could erase them. He stepped forward slowly, as if approaching a frightened animal, careful, deliberate, unhurried. The carpet muted the sound of his shoes, but each step made her chest tighten a notch more. When he reached her, he didn't touch her, didn't reach for the folder, didn't even look at it. His eyes stayed on hers, calm, steady, impossible to read. Clara wanted him to speak, wanted him to laugh it off, to tell her it was nothing, a mistake, a misunderstanding. But he didn't. He just stood there, studying her face, like it held answers to a question he'd carried for years. "Well?" The word left her lips before she could stop it, soft, brittle-edged, with something she didn't want him to see. "Why me?" She hated how small her voice sounded in this room, surrounded by velvet secrets and polished shadows. Alexander didn't flinch, didn't smile, didn't dodge. He glanced at the photos, then back at her. "It's not just you," he said quietly, "but it is you now." She shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping before she could swallow it down. "That's not an answer." Her hand brushed over the top photo again, the one that could have been her reflection, frozen in a moment she didn't remember. "What is this? Some twisted collection? Are you—" She couldn't finish the thought, couldn't give voice to the fear that prickled cold along her spine. His brow furrowed as if he'd felt the sting of her accusation. "No, it's not like that." He sat on the edge of the reading chair, elbows resting on his knees, hands folded, but still not touching her. "These women, they aren't random. I didn't seek them out like trophies." He exhaled slow, as if the words cost him something. "They all came to me, just like you did tonight." Clara's laugh was sharper this time. "Came to you? I came to clean your floors. I came because I needed the money, not because—" She cut herself off, her own anger burning too hot. She stepped away from him, from the chair, from the folder, but not far enough to reach the door. He didn't follow. He only turned his head slightly, his voice lower now, more human than she'd ever heard it, in the hallways or in whispers through the intercom. "My mother used to say that the universe has a cruel way of looping people back to where they're needed most, even when they don't know it yet." She stared at him, unblinking, not ready for the softness in his tone. Needed? For what? To be watched? Collected like this? She pointed at the folder, trembling despite the steel she forced into her voice. Alexander's eyes flicked down to her hand, then back to her face. "Do you really think I watched you, Clara? Followed you for amusement?" His tone tightened for the first time all night. "Look closer. These photos, they're from security feeds, from old cameras, from places I own or protect or fund. Look at the timestamp on the one you're holding." Against her better judgment, she did. The corner of the photo showed a date nearly a year ago. Her chest tightened as memory flickered. She remembered that day. The bus stop, the broken umbrella, the way she'd stood shivering with a cheap coffee cup clutched in frozen hands. The camera above the coffee shop door had blinked red. She'd barely noticed. She'd never imagined that tiny light would lead here. "I don't want to be protected," she said when her voice worked again. I didn't ask for that. I don't need— He cut her off, gently but firmly. You think I don't know that? You think I wanted this? For the first time, something cracked in his voice. This house, this room, this silence. You think I chose it because I like being surrounded by strangers who want pieces of me but not the truth? He stood then, the movement sudden enough that she stepped back until her spine pressed against the bookshelf. He didn't crowd her, didn't touch her, but his nearness pulled at the air between them. You were supposed to be a ghost, Clara. In and out, no trace, like all the others. But then you slipped into my shower. You made a mess of my perfect locked doors. And now— He exhaled the words softer than the storm outside. Now you know. Clara swallowed the dryness in her throat, sharp as glass. Know what, exactly? That you're lonely, that you collect women who look like shadows of each other. The cruelty in her tone surprised even her, but she couldn't hold it back. The tension, the cold confusion, it poured out of her chest in a rush she couldn't stop. Alexander's jaw clenched, but when he spoke, his voice was almost tender. That I see you. Not the maid, not the stand-in, not the girl who needed one night's paycheck. You. The one who stood in my shower, not crying, not screaming, just trying to breathe. Silence spread between them, dense enough to drown in. The rain hammered the window, a steady heartbeat. Clara's eyes flicked to the bed behind him, the chair, the folder. Everything that felt too intimate, too close. She hated how part of her wanted to believe him, how some reckless piece of her chest twisted, not with fear, but with a dangerous spark of something warm. He stepped closer this time, slow, careful, until his breath ghosted the edge of her hair. His fingers hovered at her elbow, not touching, but near enough that her skin prickled with awareness. You want to leave, Clara? I won't stop you. You want to pretend this room, this secret, this night didn't happen? I'll lock the door behind you myself. She looked up at him, the softness in his eyes undoing her more than any threat ever could. And if I stay? She whispered. His breath hitched, the smallest betrayal of calm. Then maybe for once the secret doesn't stay locked in this room. A shiver traced her spine for a reason that had nothing to do with fear. She didn't know what staying meant, didn't know what door she'd just cracked open inside herself, but when he reached out this time and brushed his knuckles lightly against her wrist, she didn't pull away. Outside, the storm raged on, relentless and unbothered, but in the quiet space between them, something fragile flickered. Something dangerous and warm, and far too real to be locked away again. Clara didn't know how long she stood there, pressed against the shelf, with Alexander so close that the fabric of his shirt brushed the back of her hand every time he breathed. The folder lay abandoned on the chair, now its glossy edges catching the muted glow of the bedside lamp. But she couldn't look at it, couldn't look away from him either. She should have left, she told herself that twice, 3 times, more, yet her feet refused to move as if the thick carpet had grown roots beneath her soles. His hand hovered near her elbow, waiting, not claiming. The restraint made it worse somehow. It made her aware of every inch of space he didn't cross, every inch of herself that wanted him to. The rain battered the glass with relentless rhythm, a steady drumming that matched the quick beat in her chest. She drew in a breath, shallow, sharp. He noticed, of course. He did. He saw everything. His lips parted as if to say something, but no sound came. Instead, he dropped his gaze to her wrist, where the pulse fluttered just beneath the skin. She flinched when his fingertips finally brushed her there, feather-light enough to make her skin spark. She hated how it made her knees weaken, how her breath caught like a tangled thread. He didn't hold her, didn't drag her closer. Just that small touch and the unspoken promise in it. Clara squeezed her eyes shut a moment, her voice raw when it finally emerged. This is crazy. I know. His thumb traced the inside of her wrist, a slow circle that felt more intimate than any kiss she'd ever known. Say the word, Clara, and I'll step back. Say it. But she couldn't. The word lodged behind her tongue, bitter and useless. What would she even call this? What did you call the moment when everything you thought you were, just a maid, just a paycheck, just one night, fell away to reveal something that terrified you more than being invisible ever had? He lifted her hand gently, as if testing whether she'd pull away. She didn't. He guided it to his chest, pressing her palm flat against the fine cotton of his shirt, right over the steady drum of his heart. It thudded, strong, certain, so real it made her own pulse stumble in response. Her fingers curled reflexively, bunching the fabric. "Feel that?" he murmured. "It doesn't lie." Clara's throat worked around words she couldn't form. Her eyes flicked up to his face so close she could see the faint lines at the corner of his eyes, lines that said he hadn't slept well in years, lines that softened when he looked at her like this. She swallowed. "I shouldn't be here." The confession came out more like a plea. "I know," he said again, softer now. He stepped even closer until his body boxed hers against the shelf, but his touch remained maddeningly restrained. His other hand lifted, ghosting over her hip without settling. "You shouldn't be, but you are." His breath touched her cheek, warm, scented faintly of the whiskey she'd seen on the shelf in the study. "And I'm not sure I want you to go." The honesty in his voice cracked something in her. Clara sucked in a shaky breath, her free hand rising instinctively to brace against his chest, right next to the one already pressed there. His heart beat under both palms, steady, relentless. It grounded her and made her dizzy all at once. "This doesn't make sense," she whispered, a half laugh that broke on the end. "You don't know me." His mouth curved just slightly, not quite a smile. "I know you stand your ground even when you're afraid. I know you speak truth even when you think you shouldn't. I know you don't flinch when someone sees you." He angled his head so close now she could count the dark lashes that framed his eyes. "And that's more than I've known about most people in years." Clara's lips parted to argue, but the words dissolved when his forehead touched hers. The contact was so simple, yet it wrecked her. No hungry kiss, no rough hands, no possessive claim. Just his skin warm against hers, the brush of his breath, the echo of rain tapping the windows behind them. Her eyes fluttered closed, the world narrowing to the heat shared in that inch of space. "You're going to regret this," she breathed. She didn't know if she meant him or herself. "Probably." The smile was in his voice now, the kind that wrapped around her ribcage like a ribbon pulled tight. "But not tonight." The hand that hovered at her hip finally settled, palm broad and sure, through the thin fabric of her uniform shirt. The contact burned not with roughness, but with quiet certainty. Clara felt the tremor in her own hands, the way her fingers curled tighter in his shirt, bunching it, wrinkling it, a billionaire's tailored shirt ruined by her need to hold on to something real. He tilted his head slightly, nose brushing hers. "Clara." He said her name like a prayer. "Tell me to stop." She should have. She thought of her mother's voice telling her to be careful, always, careful to keep her head down, to never draw attention. She thought of the stained carpet in her apartment, the stack of unpaid bills hidden in a cracked kitchen cabinet, the half-written resignation letter folded in her bag. She thought of how invisible she'd made herself for so long. Then she opened her eyes, saw him looking at her, not past her, not through her, but at her, and she knew she wouldn't stop this. Not tonight. Instead of telling him no, she rose up on her toes, just enough to close the last fraction of space. Her lips brushed his soft, hesitant. It wasn't a kiss, yet just a question, waiting for an answer. He answered by pressing back, barely at first, testing, waiting, and then deeper when she didn't flinch, when she didn't run. His mouth tasted like warmth, like rain, like secrets unspoken. The kiss unfolded slow, as if they both feared pushing too far, too fast, would break the fragile thing forming between them. His hand at her hip tightened just slightly, the other, sliding up her arm, brushing the edge of her jaw. She made a small sound into his mouth, part surprise, part relief. His answering breath caught low in his chest. When they parted, Clara's forehead rested against his again, their breathing uneven, their bodies too close now to pretend nothing had changed. She opened her eyes, met his, and for the first time that night, she saw something raw flicker there. Not power, not control, not cold calculation, but a man as unsteady as she felt. He let out a low laugh that trembled at the edges. "You're going to ruin me." Clara huffed out a breathless laugh of her own. "Then we're even." Outside the storm shifted, the windows rattling, but in the hush of the bedroom it sounded distant, harmless. He dipped his head, pressing a kiss to the corner of her mouth, then her jaw, then lower, where her pulse fluttered, frantic against her throat. She shivered, a quiet gasp escaping before she could bite it back. His lips curved against her skin, as if he liked hearing it. He pulled back just enough to see her eyes again, his thumb brushing her cheek. A tender, unspoken question. She answered by leaning in again, this time with no hesitation at all. In that quiet circle of warmth, rain tapping glass, breath mingling heartbeat to heartbeat, Clara realized that maybe she'd stepped into this room looking for a paycheck, a few hours of borrowed time, but what she'd found was something that terrified her more than secrets or security cameras, or the ache of wanting. She'd found herself seen, and she wasn't ready to let that go. Clara did not sleep that night, not really. She drifted in and out of a half-dream somewhere between the warmth of Alexander's arms and the quiet rush of her own heartbeat, trying to convince her that this was real. For hours they barely spoke, only moved in the hush of the room as the rain softened from a storm to a hush, and the city beyond the windows seemed to pause for them. He had fallen asleep first. She could tell by the way his breathing evened out against the curve of her shoulder. One arm still looped loosely around her waist, as if the world outside might try to take her away if he didn't keep that last hold. She lay awake, studying the ceiling, the shifting shadows of dawn, stretching across the fine crown molding she'd dusted countless times as a maid, but never truly seen until now. It should have felt impossible, this space beside him in a bed, too wide for any one person. The feel of his breath against the back of her neck, the soft press of his palm, heavy but somehow careful. Her fingers drifted to his wrist, tracing the lines there, the pulse that matched hers now. Hours ago, she'd told herself she was just a replacement, just a stand-in for a sick co-worker who needed a night off. Now she wasn't sure what she was. Not a maid, not really, not anymore. And not quite his, either. But something else, something that scared her more than the idea of going back to her cracked ceiling and humming fridge and stack of unopened bills. Near dawn he stirred, his voice muffled against her hair. "You're awake." It wasn't a question. She turned to face him, careful not to pull away too far from the warmth they'd built between them. His eyes were half open, dark lashes shadowing the quiet questions she could feel humming beneath his skin. "I didn't want to miss it," she whispered. "Miss what?" His hand shifted to her cheek, thumb brushing the place below her eye where sleeplessness threatened to settle. "This," she said, "whatever this is." His smile was soft, tired, and more real than the polished grins he'd offered the cameras in boardrooms. "I don't know what it is either. I just know I don't want it to end." Neither of them said what they both knew, that it would have to, eventually, that the sun would rise and the world would knock again and reality would wrap its cold fingers around the edges of their warmth. But for now, they let it stay unspoken. They drifted like that a while longer. He told her about the art he never had time to hang in the hallway she dusted every week. She told him about her brother's late-night texts, jokes she'd read under covers to keep the noise of her life at bay. They laughed once, softly, like people afraid the sound might shatter the fragile thing they'd built overnight. But time was a thief even in quiet spaces. The pale gray light spilling through the curtains shifted to gold, and with it came the whisper of life reawakening, the whir of the elevator in the hallway, the distant hush of a city ready to move again. Clara sat up, pulling the sheet with her. His hand caught her wrist before she could slide out of bed entirely. "Stay." "I can't." She hated how her voice wavered around those two words. "Why not?" She looked at him then, really looked. At the man who had been a headline, a paycheck, a mystery. And now, he was a question she wasn't ready to answer. "Because I don't belong here," she said, her words a whisper too sharp to swallow back. "I don't belong in this bed, or this building, or your life." He sat up too, the sheet falling to his waist. "You think that's for you to decide alone?" She blinked at him, stunned by the quiet honesty in his tone. He didn't sound like a billionaire then. He didn't sound like a man used to having things exactly where he put them. He sounded like a man trying to hold something precious in hands that had only ever held contracts and power. "Clara," he said, his voice low, careful, "I didn't ask you to stay because I thought you belonged to me. I asked because I—" His words faltered. He swallowed. Tried again. "I asked because I don't want this to be just a secret we hide in the dark." She looked at the window then. The first bird song broke the hush of the storm. It should have comforted her. Instead, it reminded her of all the other mornings she'd pulled on her cheap uniform and scrubbed other people's stories out of rooms she'd never live in. "Secrets don't stay secrets in your world," she said. "No." He let out a breath that was half a laugh, half a confession. "They don't?" "So what happens when someone sees?" he asked. "When someone knows? When they look at me and all they see is the maid who—" His fingers caught her chin, gentle but firm enough to tilt her gaze back to him. "When they see you, they're going to see the same thing I see." "And if they don't?" He shrugged one shoulder. "Then they don't deserve to look at you at all." The words hit her deeper than she wanted to admit. She let him see it just for a moment, the flicker of fear, the small piece of longing she'd kept hidden even from herself. "Clara," he said again, softer this time. "Stay." She thought of the paycheck she still hadn't picked up from the agency, of the subway ride back to her cramped apartment. She thought of the cracked bathroom mirror that reminded her every morning who she was supposed to be. And then she thought of this, the warmth of his chest beneath her palm, the softness in his voice that didn't sound like power, but something more terrifying. So she did. She stayed, not forever, not yet, but long enough to watch the sun break over the skyline, long enough to listen to him tell her about the house he kept by the lake but never visited, the dog he'd always wanted but never had time for. She told him about the mural she used to sketch in the back of her school notebooks, a painting of windows opening into sky. And when they rose together, when she padded barefoot to his kitchen and made coffee like she'd done so many times before, except this time she made it for both of them, she realized that maybe the secret in his bedroom wasn't the folder or the old photo. Maybe it was this, that he could want something real, that she could be something more than what she cleaned up and hid away. Hours later, she slipped back into her uniform. He didn't ask her not to. He only watched from the doorway, arms folded, his eyes following every small motion as she tied her hair back and smoothed the wrinkles from her cheap blouse. "Will you come back?" he asked. She paused, fingers stilling at the buttons near her collarbone. She thought of the headlines she might become, the questions people would ask, the way her mother would frown and tell her no good ever came from wanting too much. Then she looked at him, really looked, and saw not the empire, but the man standing barefoot in his own kitchen, looking at her like she was something he'd been trying to find in every quiet room for years. "Yes," she said finally, "I'll come back." He didn't move toward her, didn't touch her. He just smiled, small, real, and so achingly human that her chest ached with it. When she left, the city had fully woken. Taxis honked below. The glass towers burned gold in the new sun. She stepped onto the sidewalk, feeling the cold bite her cheeks, the collar of her uniform still damp with his warmth. She looked up at the skyline she'd once cleaned from the outside with a squeegee and a bucket, the skyline she'd believed she'd never touch. She thought of the key card he'd slipped into her pocket when he kissed her goodbye, the one that would open a door she'd once only entered with gloves and bleach and a bowed head. It would be waiting for her, just like him. And when she walked away down the street, the dawn at her back, Clara didn't feel like a secret anymore. She felt like a beginning. And somewhere inside, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, tomorrow's sunrise would look different too.